Welcome back, my fellow ShieldBros. It is ShieldBro6 here for the History Armada, and we have another little bit of history on today, August 14th. So today we are talking about the Atlantic Conference and its subsequent Atlantic Charter that was formed on August 14th, 1941. So, the Atlantic Charter was a joint declaration released by U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill on August 14th, 1941. Roosevelt and the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill had been meeting of the two heads of government in Newfoundland, Canada. The Atlantic Charter proved a broad statement of U.S. and British war aims. So it was their goals and their agreements on what to be done. So the meeting had been called in response to the geopolitical situation in Europe by mid-1941. Although Great Britain had been spared from a German invasion in the fall of 1940, and with the passage of the U.S. Lend-Lease Act in March 1941 was assured U.S. material support, by the end of May, German forces had inflicted humiliating defeats upon British, Greek, and Yugoslav forces in the Balkans, and were threatening to overrun Egypt and close off the Suez Canal, thereby restricting British access to its possessions in India and the Far East. When the Germans invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, few policymakers in either Washington or London really thought that they would be able to hold out. They gave them the guesstimate that the Soviet Union would be able to survive the Nazi onslaught for only 6 weeks. So while the British government focused its efforts on dealing with the Germans in Europe, they were also concerned that Japan might take advantage of the situation to seize British, French, or Dutch territories in Southeast Asia. So, Churchill and Roosevelt met on August 9th through August 11th, 1941 aboard the USS Augusta, pictured here, in Placentia Bay, Newfoundland. They aimed to discuss their respective war aims for the Second World War and to outline a post-war international system, i.e. what would become the UN. The charter they drafted included 8 common principles, or 8 goals that they agreed upon between the United States and Great Britain that they would be committed to supporting in a post-war world after beating the Axis. So this is their agreement of what to do once they win and how they are going to win. Both countries agreed not to seek territorial expansion or reimbursement, but they also agreed that they were to seek the liberalization of international trade, to establish freedom of the seas, international labor, economic, and welfare standards. So they agreed on how things would be done afterwards with trade, economy, labor, and how to treat people. Most importantly, both the United States and Great Britain were committed to supporting the restoration of self-governance for all countries that had been occupied during the war, and allowing all peoples to choose their own form of government. So, real quick hint here, supporting self-government and the allowing of self-determination as an empire might spell in trouble for your empire. Looking at Britain. So, while the meeting was successful in drafting these aims, it failed to produce the desired results for either leader. President Roosevelt had hoped that the charter might encourage the American people to support U.S. intervention in World War II on behalf of the Allies. He was really hoping that this would stir the U.S. public to be able to enter the war. However, public opinion remained adamantly opposed to any such policy until the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, so only several months later. Churchill's primary goal had been, in attending the Atlantic Conference, to get the Americans into the war. That's a quote, to get the Americans into the war. That was what he wanted to get done. But barring that, he hoped that the United States would increase its amount of military aid to Great Britain, and they hoped that the U.S. would warn Japan against taking any more aggressive actions in the Pacific. So he was not only hoping to get more equipment, but he was also hoping that the U.S. would warn Japan and threaten them to make them stop. Roosevelt, on the other hand, wanted the British government to affirm publicly that it was not involved in any secret treaties, particularly ones concerning territorial questions, such as those that concluded by the Allies during the First World War concerning the division of enemy territory at the end of the war. So he wanted to make sure and get this straight from Churchill that there was no such treaties and there would be no post-World War I issues of countries being divided or territories being divided, such as happened after World War I with European lands, African lands, and the Middle East. Roosevelt had also wanted to establish the British Forum to pay compensation by dismantling their system. He wanted a form of compensation, and he wanted it to be the removal of their imperial preference. He wanted some form of repayment for the Lend-Lease Act and assistance, which the imperial preference had been established by the British government during the Great Depression, and it was designed to encourage trade within the British Empire. It lowered tariff rates between members, so if you were trading between dominions, colonies, or the empire, it was cheaper, while maintaining discriminatory tariff rates against outsiders. So it was much more lucrative and productive for the British to trade within its empire exclusively. However, Churchill was extremely disappointed by Roosevelt's refusal to discuss American entry into the war. Furthermore, Churchill understood that several aspects of this declaration might be politically damaging as Prime Minister. Churchill had worried that the abandonment of imperial preference would anger the protectionist wing of his Conservative Party that he supported. The Americans also proved unwilling to warn Japan too strongly for fear of action against any military action against British possessions in South Asia by Japan. Finally, both Churchill and many members of his cabinet were alarmed by the third point of the charter. Remember, that comes back to what I was saying about spelling trouble for your empire. It mentions the rights of all peoples to choose their own government. Churchill was concerned that this clause acknowledged the right of colonial subjects to agitate for declaration of decolonization, including those within Great Britain's empire. He was worried that by supporting this, their subjects of the empire might see this as their opportunity or their invitation to seek decolonization. However, nevertheless, Churchill realized that the joint declaration was the most he could accomplish during this conference. While the United States was to remain neutral, the declaration would raise the morale of the British public and, most importantly, bind the United States closer to Great Britain. It locked them in this charter. It was not binding, but it was a significant groundwork. Therefore, when Churchill forwarded the text of the declaration to his cabinet on August 11th, he warned that he would be imprudent to raise unnecessary difficulties. He said, look, this is the best we're getting out of this right now, and we need them. So I will not be pushing the issue of Article 3 with the right to self-government or anything like that. The cabinet followed Churchill's recommendations and approved this Atlantic Charter. While the Atlantic Charter of August 1941 was not a binding treaty, like I said, it was nonetheless significant for several reasons. First, it publicly affirmed the sense of solidarity between the US and Great Britain against the Axis aggression. Secondly, it laid out President Roosevelt's Wilsonian-type vision for the post-war world. He had these Wilsonian views, these ideals that would be characterized by freer exchange of trade, self-determination for peoples, disarmament, and a collective security. Which, i.e., means people get to choose their own government, there is more free trade, and a body to hold the peace, which is what would become the United Nations. So you can see why this would be very important effect for this charter. So, finally, the charter ultimately did serve as an inspiration for colonial subjects throughout the Third and Second Worlds, all the way from Algeria to Vietnam to India. As they fought for independence, they took this charter as a good sign and an inspiration. So, I would be amiss if I did not mention the long-term acts of the Atlantic Charter, as we see here in 1945 with the different imperialistic holdings. So, the impact on imperial powers and imperial ambitions. Let's talk about that real quick and the other effects of this charter. So the problems came not from Germany nor Japan, but the allies that had empires and so resisted self-determination, especially within the United Kingdom, Soviet Union, and Netherlands. Initially, Roosevelt and Churchill appeared to have agreed upon that third point of the charter would not apply to Africa nor Asia. They said, okay, yes, we have self-determination, but not in this place or this place. However, Roosevelt's speechwriter Robert E. Sherwood noted that, quote, "It was not long before the people of India, Burma, Malaya, and Indonesia were beginning to ask if the Atlantic Charter did extend also to the Pacific and Asia in general," end quote. So with a war that could be won only with the help of these allies, Roosevelt's solution was to put some pressure on Britain, but to postpone the issue of self-determination until the war was won. So he basically shelved it. He said, look, I'm going to put pressure on you and you need to do this, but we can come back to this issue of the colonies after the war. So for the British Empire, the acknowledgement that all people had a right to self-determination gave hope to independence leaders in British colonies. The Americans insisted that the charter was to acknowledge that the war was being fought for self-determination after effects of Czechoslovakia and Poland being devoured by the Nazi warhounds. And in several speeches, Churchill said the charter was meant to apply only to the states under German occupation, but Churchill rejected its universal application when it came to self-determination of subject nations such as British India, and Gandhi even wrote to Roosevelt in 1942, "I venture to think that the Allied declaration that the Allies were fighting to make the world safe for the freedom of individual and for democracy sounds hollow so long as India, and for that matter Africa, are exploited by Great Britain." So Gandhi pointed out, hey, you know how you shelved that? You're a hypocrite, essentially. He called them out for this. But furthermore, other than British Empire, Poland was unhappy. Churchill was unhappy with the inclusion of references to the right to self-determination and stated that he considered the charter an interim and partial statement of war aims designed to reassure all countries of our righteous purpose and not to complete structure which we should build after the victory. So, the office of the Polish government in exile wrote to warn Władysław Sikorski that if the charter was implemented with regard to national self-determination and not taking lands as reward, would prevent the desired Polish annexation of Danzig, East Prussia, and parts of German Silesia. That led to the Poles to approach Britain and ask for a flexible interpretation of the charter. They said, hey, those lands are rightfully ours. We don't like the way you're talking. Can we have a flexible interpretation for our needs? And lastly, when it comes to the Baltic States, during the war, Churchill argued for an interpretation of the charter that would allow the Soviet Union to continue to control the Baltic States, an interpretation that was rejected by Roosevelt and the United States until March of 1944. Lord Beaverbrook warned that the charter, quote, would be a menace to our Britain's own safety as well as to that of the Soviet Union, end quote. The United States refused to recognize the Soviet takeover of the Baltic States, but did not press the issue against Stalin while he was fighting the Nazi Germans. Roosevelt had planned to raise the Baltic issue adamantly after the war, but unfortunately he died in 1945 before the fighting had ended in Europe. Which, if he had survived, that might have changed how some things went, but who knows. Well, thank you so much for watching my Shield Bros. I'm ShieldBros6. I hope you learned a little bit on this August 14th about the Atlantic Charter and its very important effects on world history and the outcome of World War II and the post-war world. Things such as decolonization, the United Nations, a combined effort against the Axis, and the idea of self-determination. So I hope you caught on to those ideas and you learned a little something. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, go ahead and leave me a like. If you didn't, hit that dislike. If you have any comments, suggestions, concerns, ideas, anything at all, questions, whatever, put that in the comment section down below for me. So, as always, I am ShieldBros6 for the History Armada, and thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch y'all next time. Cheers for now.